We are less than a week away from two crucial Senate runoffs in Georgia that will decide which party controls the U.S. Senate. Republican incumbents David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler are being challenged by Democrats Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. More than 2.5 million people have already voted in those two races, a record for a Georgia runoff election. Both President Trump and President-elect Biden will campaign in the state next week. CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Joel Payne joins us from Washington, D.C. Good morning, Joel. I've got Georgia on my mind. I know Georgia's on your mind, so I'm so glad to have you joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So the Democrats need to win both of these seats in order to flip the Senate. What are you hearing from your sources on the ground about their chances of doing that?
Democrats feel optimistic, but I think they're also realistic. Listen, in a runoff election that's not on election day, that's in a state like Georgia, which is, yes, it's trending purple, but as someone on the ground told me, it's a red shade of purple. I think Democrats still understand it's really a long shot. I think turnout's important. I think those early vote numbers you just cited, the record 2.5 million early vote numbers, are really encouraging to Democrats. But I think it's really about ground game over the next 96 or so hours. And I think you're going to see Democrats really pull out all the stops to mobilize. You talked about President-elect Biden. Kamala Harris was in state earlier this week. They're going to have all their heavies there in state because we all know the Senate rests on this.
Stacey Abrams, of course, was credited by many for helping Joe Biden win Georgia because of her turnout efforts in the black community. Will those same voters turn out in this runoff, especially since voters tend not to turn out in as high numbers during runoffs?
I think that's a good question. The electorate is probably going to look a little bit different. One of the things in talking to people on the ground in Georgia, they'll say that Stacey Abrams and her folks, the way they organized was really service-oriented. And I'll be curious to see whether they can take that same approach for this runoff election, which is, again, 45 days after the general election and kind of in the middle of a really interesting political season for Georgians. Stacey Abrams has really been viewed on Democrats, among Democrats, as kind of the MVP of this cycle for putting Georgia in play. Not just in this runoff, but really for helping Joe Biden deliver the state 2 months ago.
What do you mean by service-oriented?
Well, that's interesting, right? So going and organizing people around what their needs are, helping people get unemployment checks or helping people connect to social services and using that to register voters. That's actually something that Democrats have used in the state to be effective. Also, it's not just African Americans. I know that that's a niche issue people like to talk about. It's also Asian Americans and Latinos in Georgia are really surging populations, and Abrams and her organizers have really taken advantage of that as well.
So true. So President Trump has, of course, made unfounded attacks against Georgian election officials, claiming that that election was rigged, essentially. How do you think that might affect his supporters in terms of them even coming out to the polls? Do they still trust the process?
That's a good question. I know that Georgia Republican officials have to be concerned about that. I mean, essentially what President Trump is asking Georgia Republicans to believe is that his election was corrupt in some way, but all these other state officials in Georgia were in on it, that Brian Kemp and the Secretary of State, who are all Republicans who voted for Donald Trump, that they worked with Democrats to steal the election from him. That's a tall tale to tell. The backside of that is whether Georgians will actually trust the process. Georgia voters who like Donald Trump, are they going to trust the process? So you have this interesting dynamic here of where you need Donald Trump to heat up the base if you're a Republican, but you're also concerned about him depressing excitement and depressing enthusiasm.
So, Joel, tell us, are we in for another election week, or should we know the results on election night?
Well, I would put it like this. If we know what happens on election night, my sense is it's probably a good night for Republicans because it's probably an easy victory for Perdue and Loeffler. If it takes a little bit longer, that's probably better for Democrats because that means it's a closer election. And really, Democrats' best chance here is if it's a close election that they can eke out.
Speaking of Perdue and Loeffler, what do you think are their chances? How will the fact that they support the $2,000 stimulus check, how do you think that'll affect them quickly because we don't have a ton of time?
They did what they needed to do. I think what's interesting is how this race has really got shrouded in race. Kelly Loeffler has been campaigning with someone who is purported to be a part of the Ku Klux Klan. She's been making attacks on Raphael Warnock. So that has really become kind of a central issue in the race over the last 72 hours or so. We'll see if that carries through to Election Day.
Joel Payne, thank you.